So we've seen before the kinds of organisms that can do photosynthesis. We've talked about how they have different independent origins of photosynthesis. And starting next class, we're going to piece this all together. And I think it'll make a lot of sense once we get it all together. But needless to say, I guess we have different origins, and maybe we want to start looking at the original origin of photosynthesis here. So in addition to the organisms we've seen already, there's quite a few other members of this eukaryotic group, or eukarya, this whole domain of life. That includes humans, animals, fungi, plants, also our algae, and not the cyanobacteria. So lots of diversity in the organisms that can do photosynthesis that are eukaryotes. Not a whole lot of diversity in the bacterial photosynthetic bacterial organisms. So kind of have different phylogenetic groups here, but they share something in common that we know is rare and really hard to just evolve out of the blue. So we're going to see an interesting connection between these that might go beyond just how they're related to each other. So we're going way back in time right now. I think our first class, I showed you a timeline of the history of the world. The world is over 4.5 billion years old. And the evidence of life, as I pointed out once before, goes back, I'd say, pretty impressively close to the origin of the planet. If you imagine that the planet was formed as this ball of gas, fiery rock, not really the conditions anything should be alive under. 1 billion years later, I guess less than 1 billion years after the Earth formed, who knows, is that a long time? I can't tell you. But there were conditions that were good enough for life to get going on our planet. And we have some really old rocks with some really old evidence for life. It just kind of blows my mind to think that somewhere on Earth are rocks 3.5 billion years old. They go by the name of stromatolites. It's this particular rock formation. And it's kind of curious that we have them as fossils, and we also see this phenomenon still happening today in living bacteria. Basically, there's kind of a sheet of bacteria on the surface of this kind of dome or pincushion-shaped rock. And the bacteria on the surface, they're producing like a biofilm. So they're kind of making a biologically important layer on top of rock and actually on top of the bodies of old bacteria. And you can see them as these formations that have lines or striations. So this is sort of here on the left, kind of sliced through. And then also showing some layers where those bacteria were added on over billions of years, turns out. So geologists can date this way back, 3.7 billion years ago, evidence for life. So we don't see the cells of those bacteria, but it's a formation that's known to be associated with life and not known to be associated with, say, an abiotic, just an earth process that sometimes happens. But in this case, definitely something that was alive. So an interesting next step, so life happened, shown in this diagram. So life, bacteria, and at some point after life came around, life evolved on our planet, at some point later, photosynthesis came along. So without photosynthesis, the organisms that were alive, they would have had to get their energy from heat or from maybe chemical digestion of rocks that were available to them, so sort of scavenging energy in the environment. But when photosynthesis came around, this opened up this possibility to make energy from light. Light was quite abundant back in the day, so the sun has been shining, as far as I know, every day for since the dawn of the world. And so when photosynthesis came around, organisms, bacteria could take advantage of that, use it to make energy. And there's kind of an interesting bunch of time here in between the start of photosynthesis, so the earliest evidence for photosynthesis, and what this diagram is calling the oxygen-rich atmosphere. So there's a period of time when, let's see, let me back up. So the Earth, when it was formed, did not hardly have any oxygen in the atmosphere. Kind of take that for granted, right? Oxygen is important to life, you say. And I say, yes, that's true today. But originally, there wasn't really oxygen in the atmosphere. And as I've said before, when photosynthesis came around, oxygen was a waste product. And it's actually a problem for organisms to encounter oxygen. So you've heard of oxidation. Oxidation is a problem. Wreaks havoc on molecules and cellular systems. And so when photosynthesis released oxygen to the atmosphere, the organisms had to deal with that, actually killed quite a few of them. But we don't really see the global oxygen levels get up to what they call oxygen-rich atmosphere. We don't see that for a very long time. Looks like about 1 billion years it takes to accumulate all that oxygen in the atmosphere. Where did it go? Well, there weren't initially a whole lot of organisms doing this photosynthesis. Another place where the oxygen went is that it was being sucked into the rocks and the minerals that it was oxygenating. So, oxidizing, I should say. So like oxidation is another name for rusting, rusting all the available metals out there. And eventually there was just so much oxygen that it did in fact build up into an oxygen-rich atmosphere, as this diagram shows. So the dates on these might not always agree 100%. There's, I don't know how well you can date something within a give or take 100 million years. They're doing their best. All right, so after the world became rich in oxygen, then these other groups came along, eukaryotes, multicellular life, animals, and so on. Some of our evidence for the oxygenation of the atmosphere is actually the first presence of rust. So there are these bands of red iron. So before oxygen was in the atmosphere, the rocks that were produced at that age, they would not have oxidized in the atmosphere. They're just not oxygen present in the atmosphere. But at some point, there's enough oxygen in the atmosphere. As far as we know, the only reason the oxygen is there in the atmosphere is because photosynthesis was happening. So sort of nice geologic evidence for a biological process showing up in the fossil record very long time ago, 3.46 billion years ago. So about here, photosynthesis showing that evidence of oxidized iron formation. So who was doing all this photosynthesis? Well, the organisms around at that time, if you saw, this was all predating eukaryotes. And so this by and large would be bacteria. And again, we still have today photosynthetic cyanobacteria. They're rather simple organisms, single-celled or strands of single cells. And they can do photosynthesis, but they are themselves bacteria. So they would not have, obviously bacteria don't have organelles, so bacteria do not have chloroplasts, but in these cyanobacteria, sort of the whole cell kind of functions like a chloroplast, as we'll see in a little bit. So cyanobacteria are, they're not all that visible. I mean, you wouldn't see them as single organisms, but you can see a lot of evidence of cyanobacteria. Kind of unfortunately, I don't know, I want people to call them cyanobacteria. I think it sounds tougher. Like, I would like to avoid something called cyanobacteria. Blue-green algae sounds a little more harmless. In fact, they're quite harmful. So when these cyanobacteria get at high densities, they have the ability to produce toxins. So it's one of their sensing of high density. One of their responses to that is to toxify the water they're in. And so when you get one of these so-called blooms, green algae blooms, blue-green algae bloom, or more properly, a cyanobacterial bloom, this can be toxic to anybody or any animal that gets into the water. This is actually something people have been very sick. People's dogs have died as a result of this. So it's not a small thing, and certainly something to be aware of. The potential for cyanobacteria to become a health concern. So responds to, this is also a response to increased nutrients in environments. So as we talk about environmental change, it's not just something that was always there, but it's a little more prevalent now that we have more nutrients in the water. Okay, so I mentioned that cyanobacteria are not, or don't have their own chloroplast, but they kind of look like their own chloroplast, in particular with a whole lot of membranes. So again, we saw membranes being important to the process of photosynthesis, membranes in the chloroplast, and also now membranes within the cyanobacteria. But other than that, these are prokaryotes. They don't have a nucleus. They don't have organelles. They just have strategic packing of their membranes to facilitate photosynthesis. Another skill that we see in some, not all, of these cyanobacteria, we talked about carbon fixation. It's also possible for them to do nitrogen fixation. So very similar story, but with a different element here. So carbon fixation, CO2 is not useful to us, but plants can turn it into sugar. Nitrogen fixation, the atmospheric nitrogen is very abundant, but our bodies just breathe it in and out, and there's nothing, no biological component to that. But if you are a nitrogen fixing bacterium, you can take that nitrogen that's in the atmosphere and slap it into a molecule like, here we have ammonia, NH3, and then that molecule can be the building block for molecules that need nitrogen. So carbon molecules are pretty abundant throughout organic life. Carbon found in sugars, DNA, proteins, etc. Nitrogen, also very important, found in your proteins and DNA also. So without these building block nutrients of fixed carbon and fixed nitrogen, we really wouldn't have any building blocks for, for our cells. I don't want to show you all the fine details of this, but it's kind of interesting that there are specialized cells that cyanobacteria can use. They're called heterocysts. So heterocyst just means a different kind of cell than the rest. And what they do is they pack up this airtight cell among other cells, and that airtight cell can do the nitrogen fixation. And I think that's probably all the detail we need to go in now. Some cyanobacteria can do nitrogen fixation. Lots of bacteria that are not cyanobacteria can do nitrogen fixation. And other organisms can make use of the nitrogen once it is fixed. So if you are in for taking supplements, it's possible sometimes that you might take a supplement of cyanobacteria. This one called spirulina is a cyanobacteria. And in general, organisms that can fix nitrogen are going to have more nitrogen available to organisms that eat them. So nitrogen, as I mentioned, important for proteins and DNA. I guess if you want to up your available nitrogen, you could eat some spirulina powder. Why not? Biologically, there are some symbioses between green plants and cyanobacteria. So the green plants don't need any help doing photosynthesis. They got that covered. But they do enjoy having a little extra help in the nitrogen fixation department. And it's pretty common, okay, maybe not common, but it's widespread through plant kingdom to have this arrangement with bacteria that can help you get nitrogen. So if you can increase your available nitrogen, you got an edge over your neighbors who don't have that nitrogen. And I just want to highlight here that there are examples with their respective headlines from different plant groups throughout life. So here we have a non-vascular land plant, a seedless vascular plant, a non-flowering seed plant, and a flowering seed plant, all partnering with cyanobacteria to help them get some more nitrogen. All right, so that was kind of an introduction to the concept of photosynthesis. Next up, we'll talk about photosynthetic eukaryotes and their diversity.